Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to look at getting started with SingleStore and C# using a micro-ORM like Dapper. Let's dig in. First thing we need to do, sign up for a free SingleStore license. Next, spin up a cluster in the spot that makes the most sense for us. And 3, we'll run our app. Perfect. Sign up for a license. So we'll come here, we'll fill in the form, and ultimately once we click the link on the email, we'll land here inside the portal. If we click on software licenses, we can grab our license. We'll need this. Great. Step 2, let's start up our container. Now we could choose containers, we could choose virtual machines, we could choose the managed service where we need not do anything. It'll get spun up automatically. Let's use containers in this case. Together, in this sample, we have a Docker Compose file that gives us all of the details that we need to be able to spin up our SingleStore cluster. We'll set our license key in place, we can choose a password, and when we're ready, ultimately we'll spin up that cluster. I've got the cluster already running and ready to go. With that cluster running, we can come to localhost 8080 and we can start to log in. I'll log into localhost. My username is root, and my password I set in the Docker Compose file. We can see our cluster health, we can see the total memory usage and disk usage. Let's switch over to the query editor. Now the cool thing is part of spinning up our cluster, we've already passed in the init.sql and it got run automatically. Let's select star from messages and we'll see that we already have that initial data in place. Perfect. Now let's flip over to the C#. Our next step is configuring the connection details. Our database is running at localhost, the port is 3306, user is root, and password is password here, and our database is Acme. If we were running in other locations, we might need to adjust these details. But so far, I think this looks great. Let's run it and take a look and see how it does. The purpose of this application is to get a feel for all of the pieces. So insert, read, update, delete. We'll do each of these mechanisms so we can get a feel for how that works with Dapper and SingleStore. Let's take a look at the code and see how each of those is done. Our first step is to create a connection string. Now, this uses a standard MySQL connection, so we'll use the standard NuGet package for MySQL. Here's that MySQL.data NuGet package, and we also have Dapper. SingleStore is MySQL compatible in most things, so we can use the standard MySQL.net driver. With that connection string in place, we'll create a MySQL connection, and we'll use that connection everywhere else. We do have one class up here that has an ID that is a little bit more interesting than just an int, content that is a string, create date that is a date time. Just enough variety that we can get a feel for how the system works. We're going to create one. We'll pass in our connection and the content that we want to create, and we'll return back the ID. Ultimately, we'll write out the inserted row ID. Let's go pass in that ID and see if we can read one back out, and if so, we'll write it to the console. Perfect. We'll choose to update it, setting the content to updated row. Then let's go read all. We'll get the original one and the one that we just modified. And so we'll loop through each of those, writing out their content. And finally, we'll delete the row. Let's take a look at how each of those is done. We're passing in our connection and the content that we want to do, and we're just forming a regular SQL query here. Now we are parameterizing this content, so we're passing in a new object with that content, and that will get set into place. And then we're selecting back the ID that we ran. That's an unsigned long, and so we'll return that as a long. Straight SQL works just fine with Dapper. Next up, we're going to read one. Here's our select star from messages where ID equals ID. Again, we're parameterizing this query so we're safe from SQL injection. Read all. Select star from messages, order by ID. We'll grab that content and we'll return that as a list of messages back to the caller. Perfect. Update. pass in our ID and our new content string, and we'll run the SQL query to update it. Delete, we'll just go delete the message where the ID equals ID, and now that message is gone. So we're able to run create, read one, read many, update, delete. We've got all of the mechanisms. We can expand this to include lots of tables, lots of data. Dapper and C# with SingleStore works really well. Great, so let's see how it did. We inserted a row. We read that row back. Here's that row that we inserted right now. We updated the row, so where it previously said inserted, and now it says updated. We'll read all the rows back out, and then ultimately we'll delete that row. Perfect. Our solution worked just fine. Grab the code from the repository and link in the description to this video, and get started with C# and Dapper with SingleStore today. Thanks for watching.